Good to see you. Why don't you take a seat?
That song is one of the songs that we would sing in the church that I grew up in way back when. And that actually was my dad's favorite song. And so I always loved hearing and singing that song. It's also incredibly applicable to what we are going to be talking about today. I think when we get into the story that we're going to look at, you're going to see the faithfulness of God just all over this story. So I'm excited about that. We're actually starting a new series this week. We are jumping into a series that we are calling Connected, and it's all about relationships. So for the next 5 weeks or so, we're going to be talking about relationships and the way that those work best, the way that they work when we do them the way that God intended them to be done. So I hope that you'll plan to be with us over the next 5 weeks for those messages. But as we jump in today, let me just share a quick story with you. Some of you have heard some of this before, but when I was a kid, my parents let me have some freedoms. They let me make certain decisions, but there were certain things that they decided, probably before I was even born, that they said, John, we just don't care what you think about this. This is the way that we're going to do it. Whether you like this or not, this is the rule. This is the way it's going to go, right? And one of those things was that when I graduated from high school, and that was understood as well. I mean, if it takes you until you're 57 years old, you're going to graduate from high school. And when you do that, you're going to college. That's just the plan. And that was one of those things that my parents didn't give me a choice in. And so that was kind of a big transition for me. I went from a really small high school to a really big university. And so the school that I went to in high school was a private school. From K through 12, we had like 350 people total in the school. Did any of you guys go to small schools as well? And nobody wants to admit it. So, all right, so I can tell you then that if you went to a big school, this is always impressive to big school people. I graduated 5th in my class. Yeah, and if you had a huge class, you know, that sounds really good. I was like in the middle of the curve for me. You know, we had 36 people in my graduating class. And so in high school, you know, I went to school where you kind of knew everybody. Even if you didn't know my name, you recognized them. You recognized them by sight. Everybody in the school you kind of knew. And so went from that to a university where there were 20,000 students. So like double the size of Wellington. And that's how many students there are. And I knew 3 people. Out of all of those people, and really only knew one of them well. And so for my first couple of weeks in school, my first couple of weeks in college, my favorite times were the times where I was out of class so that I could connect with those 2 or 3 people that I actually knew. So my favorite times up front were going out to eat and hanging out, playing basketball, or just hanging out in the dorms or whatever it was. But, you know, I think all of us have this thing inside of us that we want connection. We want to be connected to somebody. It really doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. We all want connections. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter if you grew up in a huge city like New York or Los Angeles, or if you grew up in a Fort Collins kind of city, or if you grew up in Carr. It doesn't matter. We're all the same in that we want connections. Every one of us want to have certain relationships that matter in life. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but you know what happens. When something big happens in your life, what do? You want to go tell somebody, right? Or now it may be, I want to get on Facebook and show everybody. So if you kill a trophy elk, you're not just going to keep that to yourself and just go about your, no, you're going to go tell everybody, you're going to post the pictures, you're going to do, because we want connection. That's just the way that God wired us. That's the way that He made every one of us. If you get a promotion at work and you get the dream job that you've always wanted to have, what are you going to do? You're going to go tell people. You're excited about it. You want to share this with the people around you. And that's just the way that we function. That's just the way that we work. But if you're in any relationships, you know, like I know, that relationships can be messy. And because of that, sometimes we drift away. Because of that, sometimes we put a little space between us and others. And so over the next few weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about 3 key relationships and how we can have these relationships healthy in the way that we should have them. So the first relationship that we're going to talk about is our relationship with God. And guys, this is where every other healthy relationship flows. This is what sets up the stage for every other healthy relationship. So if you're at a place where you're saying, you know what, I've never really had a connection to God. I've come to church, I've been figuring out this faith thing, but people talk about a relationship with God, and I don't know what that means. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how to start in that relationship. It may be that you do have a relationship with God, but it just hasn't been what it's supposed to be, what it needs to be recently. Maybe you've just been going through the motions, and it's like, you know what, I've done all the religious things, but I'm not connecting. And so we're going to talk about that first. And then we're going to talk about community. Maybe you need to initiate relationships with the church community or the Wellington community. Maybe you need a new beginning. Maybe you went on Let's Talk Wellington and posted anything, and you got attacked by everybody for posting just whatever, and you're thinking, okay, I just need to start over. I need a fresh start here, a new beginning. And we're going to talk about some of those kind of things over the next few weeks. And then finally, we're going to wrap up the series by talking about relationships in family. And you guys know this as well, but you can live under the same roof with other people and be going in completely different directions from them. And so we're going to talk about family and what it means to truly be connected in the way that God wants us to be connected with our spouse, with our kids, with the other people that are living under the roof that we are living under. So that's where we're going over the next few weeks. And today we're starting out by talking about the connection with God, talking about connecting to Him. And if we're honest, I don't care how long you've been around church, how long you've been a part of faith, if we're honest, you have to ask yourself, okay, how do you really connect with a God that you probably have never seen, probably have never heard speak out loud, right? How do you connect with that kind of God? How do you have a relationship with somebody that doesn't talk back to you in the way that other people talk back to you? And that's the question that we're going to start wrestling with this morning. And to do that, we're going to look at a story that's found in the book of Daniel. I don't know if you've been in Daniel recently, but Daniel is a guy who is known as a prophet. If you're like me, when you hear the word prophet, you may think, okay, that means he's having dreams and he's talking about the future. And yeah, he's doing that to some degree, but just for our information here this morning, when the Bible talks about prophets, what it's talking about is anybody who hears from God and then turns around and tells other people what God is saying. So it doesn't matter where that's happening in history. It may be something about the past, it may be something about the present, it may be something about the future, but they are hearing from God and then telling people what God is saying. So just to give you an example, if you were with us over the last couple of months, we went through 1st and 2nd Samuel. You remember the story of David and Bathsheba, right? And David's trying to cover it up, and we talked through that whole scenario where there's a prophet that comes to David after all of that happens. His name is Nathan. And he comes and he tells David this story about a wealthy man who had all these sheep, and he stole the one sheep from the poor guy. You may remember that story. He's talking about an event in the past, but it's prophetic. He's saying, God's telling me you have gotten yourself into this mess, and you need to get it fixed. You need to straighten this out, right? So that's prophecy. Doesn't matter if it's past, present, or future. That's what Daniel does. He listens to God, hears from God, and then shares that information with people. So just to are a scholar on the history of the Middle East, you may not remember some of this stuff. So let me just put it in perspective. Daniel lives about 2,600 years before us, so a long time ago, right? He lived from about 600 BC to around 500 BC. And during that time, there's a lot of change that's happening in the Middle East. There's an empire that rises during that time called the Babylonian Empire. And they kind of come and take over. And before that, for a couple hundred years, the Assyrians were ruling the Middle East. But now the Babylonians come, they invade Jerusalem, they invade Israel. They conquer all the nations around it, right? But they conquer Israel as well. In 587 BC, they went into Jerusalem and tore down the temple, completely destroyed everything. And the way that they thought during this time, the way that nations thought, the way that people thought was that if our nation conquers your nation, if Babylon conquers Israel, that means not only do we have a better army, but it also means that our God, the God of Babylon, is stronger than the God of Israel. the God of Babylon has defeated the God of Israel. That's the mindset of the people in this time. Okay, and so there's a king in Babylon named Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar sets up this incredible statue because, I mean, if his God is the one that's leading this, they have conquered all these nations, and so he sets up this incredible statue to his God that is 90 feet tall. I don't know what to compare that to exactly, but if you know, if you picture a basketball goal in your mind, it's 10 feet tall, stack 9 of those on top of each other. That's how big this statue, I mean, huge, right? 90 feet tall, 10 feet wide, and he covers it in gold. And he tells everybody there, you're going to come bow down to this God. Whenever we play the music, whenever the music starts, you have to come, you have to bow down to this God because this is the most powerful God on earth. He's conquered all the other nations. That's what the king of Babylon is saying. Well, there are some Jews living in Babylon, the capital city, where they have been deported from Israel, and now they are slaves to the Babylonians. Some of these Jews started to kind of rise among the slave ranks, and so there's a guy named Daniel, who the book is written by. There's some friends of his named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know if you remember, if you've been in church for a long time, you've probably seen felt board illustrations of these guys, right? And so these guys have kind of risen among the ranks of the slaves, of the servants, and they are servants of the king at this point in time. And so the king, remember, has given this order. Everybody's to bow down to this idol. But these Jewish guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they just don't play along. When everybody else goes to do their thing and bow down, well, they just keep going about their business. They do whatever they can do before. And so that's where we're going to jump into the story in Daniel chapter 3. At this point, what's happening is King Nebuchadnezzar has basically brought these guys into his office, all right? He has a personal conversation with them. He's their boss, right? They are servants of his. He brings them in, and it's kind of like, maybe you didn't get the memo the first time we sent it out. Maybe you didn't understand. I don't know, but I'm hearing reports that you're not bowing down to my God. And so he's confronting them about that. Daniel chapter 3, we'll start in verse 15. And go from there. So it says this. Now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. So, in other words, like I said, he's kind of like, maybe you just missed the memo, right? Maybe you didn't get the message. And if you want to start doing it now, we'll just call it no big deal, no problem. You can start bowing down to this God now, the way that you're supposed to. But he throws a little caveat on the end of that. And I've told this to my daughters at times when they were in trouble. He's basically going to say, look, if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, your life is going to get really miserable, right? And so the way that he phrases that is he says this. He says, but if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So he's looking at this whole scenario, right? And he's saying, our God has defeated your God. Our God is stronger than your God. And if you think you can get by without doing what our God says to do, who's going to save you? Your God can't stand up to our God. Right? That's the whole scenario that he's setting up in front of these guys. Is he's saying, you need to worship this statue. You need to bow down when I tell you to bow down here. And what we're about to see, guys, is we're about to see the way that these guys respond to that shows us how to connect to God. Okay? It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter what your background's like. It doesn't matter, what you've gotten into in the past. This is the way that you start connecting to God. They're about to show us that in this story. Before we just dive into that, just a quick side note, because this applies to the next few weeks. I want you to notice that it's not just one guy here. It's 3 guys, right? They're standing together in this. I don't know if that's because they didn't have the courage to do it on their own. I don't know if just Shadrach was there by himself, if he would have actually, stood up to the king. But while they're together, they have strength, and they end up doing this together. Just a quick side note and principle here. God designed us to connect to Him through community. We can connect to Him one-on-one, right? But He designed the church. He's the one who set this up. And so He wants us to come together and connect to Him in community. Like I said, more on that next week. So listen to the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse 16 says this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Again, I don't know anything other than what this story tells about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but apparently these guys were a little bit bold, right? They are talking to probably the most powerful man in the entire world at that point in time. They are talking to the guy who is over all of the Middle East, the leader of the empire of Babylon. This is also their boss, right? They're talking to him, and he says, just remember, if you don't do what I say, you end up in the furnace. And they say, we don't really have to answer to you on this. Thanks for your input, though. That takes a little bit of courage. You know, that takes a little bit of gumption to stand there and say, we don't have to defend ourselves because our God that you think you have defeated is still the only true God. But that's what they say. Verse 17, they say, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. So they again say, I know you're saying your God defeated our God. Our God is able to save us from anything at any point in life. Our God, the God of Israel, they say, is the only living God. So He is able to save us from it, and He will rescue us from your hand, O King. But even if He does not, and I love this, because they're just being realistic. They're saying our God can do this. But even if He chooses not to save us, they say. Now I lost my place. Even if He does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Pretty incredible statement of faith from these guys. And it starts to unfold for us what it means to really connect to God. So let's just stop for a second and process this. Let's talk through it for just a second. This is a situation where a lot of guys in this time had huge portions of the Old Testament memorized. We don't know if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had it memorized. If they were more like us, though, they may remember certain things that God has said, and other things are hard to remember. So if you think back to the 10 Commandments, the 10 rules that God gave Israel, do you remember what the very first one is? I don't know if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remembered all 10 commandments. They may have been like me where they got them scrambled up or they couldn't remember some or whatever. But the first one, the very first command that God gave Israel was this. He said, you're not to worship any other gods. Don't make any other gods. Don't make anything that looks like my image. You're to worship me and me alone. That's the first commandment. That's the one thing that God told them. That's the one thing on their mind as they're standing there looking at this 90-foot tall statue that they're supposed to bow down to. The thing that's on their minds is you are not to worship. You are not to bow down to any other gods. And so they're looking at this God and they have that in their mind. The one thing God has told us is don't bow down to other gods. Now, let's just think through the situation. Put yourself in their shoes, okay? They are in a foreign land. They have been deported. They are slaves. There's every reason for them to start making excuses right here. When you have God saying, don't bow down to any other gods, and then you have a man standing in front of you saying, if you don't bow down to this God, you will go in this furnace and be burned to death. You will be thrown in the fire. You would probably start rationalizing, right? I would start rationalizing. They have every reason to start rationalizing. They could have said to themselves, you know what? We could bow down to this God, but not mean it in our hearts. And, you know, it won't be a big deal, right? Because we're not really worshiping. We're just going through the motion. They could have said,
everybody else is doing it. It's really not that big a deal. It's not going to hurt our relationship with God. They could have said anything they wanted to. They could have rationalized this in so many different ways. They could have said, you know what, God put us in this position and we're kind of here in the palace. We're with the king. We have an opportunity to influence this entire empire. We need to just stay alive long enough to influence these people. They could have rationalized this any way they wanted, but they knew that God said this one thing. Just don't bow down to other gods. Just don't worship other gods. Does any of this feel familiar? Because it feels familiar to me. This is what happens in our lives all the time. Where God gives us one thing, and he says, I want you to just pay attention to this. And it may be different for you than it is for me because relationships are all different. You're in a different place in life than I am. And so what the one thing that God is telling you in life to pay attention to may be different than what he's telling you. But it's really easy to rationalize that away. And what ends up happening is for so many of us, we get to a place where we say, you know what, I love God. I really do love God. But I keep finding myself bowing down to my career. I really love God, but I keep finding myself bowing down to material possessions or relationships or a hobby or whatever it is. I love God, but I find myself bowing down to this other idol over and over and over again. That's so common. That's what all of us tend to do, guys. But what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do is the opposite of that. And they, through their actions, show us how to start connecting to God. So here's kind of the big idea that I want to throw out to you a little early this morning. This is where it all begins. Connecting with God starts by doing what he wants us to do. That one thing that he told them, they did it. They didn't compromise. They didn't say, well, what about this? What about this? They did the one thing that God asked them to do. And the way that we start to connect with God is by listening to him, understanding whether it's hearing through the Bible, whether it's hearing through a church service, whether it's hearing through friends and circumstances, whatever it is that you know where God has spoken to you, is listening to him and doing the one thing that he's asked you to do. That's where a connection with God starts. That's where a relationship starts, by actually doing what he's asked you to do. So watch what happens as a result of them doing the one thing that God asked them to do. Verse 19 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. And if you're like me and you like to try to picture things mentally, the best examples that we have of what this furnace would look like, and they probably used it to refine metals and do all kind of things like that. But it was probably a huge, basically metal container that looks like an upside down honeycomb almost, with an opening at the top, right, where they could put stuff in at the top, and then, the huge round honeycomb look, and then at the very bottom, they would have had a door at the bottom where you could, probably just an opening, where you could see in there, where after the fire was gone, people could go in there and clean out the ashes and all that kind of stuff, right? And so that's what's going on here. These guys bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, walk them up to the top of this furnace where flames are coming out of the top of the furnace, and get ready to throw them in. Verse 21. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. We talked a little bit about this last week, but I just want to hit pause for a second here because this is important, all right? They are thrown into the furnace. Did they listen to God? Yes. Did they do the one thing that God was asking them to do? Yes. They did not bow down to this other God. Did God save them from the fire? No. Just because we do what God asks us to do doesn't mean things are going to turn out the way that we dream they will turn out. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. In this case, God did not save them from the fire. But what you're going to see is that he saved them through the fire. He saved them in the middle of the fire. So listen to the next few verses. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And that phrase is an interesting phrase because what he's saying is that 4th guy doesn't look like everybody else. And I don't know exactly what he is or who he is, but something incredible is going on here. Some people speculate that may have been Jesus, that Jesus came and walked in the fire with them. Some people say it was an angel. Whatever it was a supernatural being from God that came to walk with them through the fire. And that's the promise that God always gives us. He says, you know what? You may not be protected from the fire at times, but if you go through the fire, I will go through it with you. I will walk through this with you. I will protect you while you are walking through it. And that's exactly what he did here for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So being a believer, being a Christian, doesn't mean that everything all of a sudden turns up roses and everything is great. What it does mean is that while you're in the fire, God is with you, protecting you. And that's what happens for these guys here. Did you notice the story play out, though? They did the one thing that God asked them to do, and they did that up front. And after they did the one thing that God asked them to do, then they experienced the presence of God. Then they connected. Then they had a relationship. Then it became this whole new level. After they did what God asked, then they experienced the presence of God. Just finishing out the story in verse 26. Says Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace. So he goes to that door kind of at the front, or that opening at the front. And he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. I love picturing things in my mind. Can you imagine what these guys are thinking? They have just witnessed these guys be thrown into the fire. They have witnessed the ones who took them up there, the strong men who bound them and took them up there. They have witnessed them die because of the heat of the fire at the opening. And all of a sudden, these guys come walking out, out of that door, and everybody crowds around them, and they're probably kind of poking them and like, what are you? Because you are not normal. A human being should not survive that, right? And they're kind of smelling their clothes like, I don't get this. Why aren't you dead? Why aren't your clothes burned up? And it says, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Pretty powerful statement from the king who just built a 90-foot tall statue of his God to come to the point where he says, oh, apparently the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, apparently the God of Israel is really God. Huge statement on behalf of the king. But the connection happened because these guys knew the one thing God asked them to do, and they did it. So let's just, again, bring it into reality here. What does that look like for us? How does that work for us? I would guess that most of us in here would say, I'm not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I wish I had the courage that they had. But I don't know that I could stand up to my boss if they told me to do this or they were going to kill me. I don't know that I could stand up in the way that they did. So how does a normal person like me, with a normal background or a messed up background, how does a normal person connect to the living God? And you know what the answer is? It's the same for us that it is for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I believe that God says connecting to Him starts by doing what He has asked us to do. What's the one thing that you feel like God has been telling you to do? What is the one thing that has been on your heart and your mind and you just feel like, man, I really believe this is the voice of God directing me to do this. What is your one thing? Here's what I want us to do. We try to challenge all of us to some degree to walk in a different way as we walk out of here. We challenge us to start doing this. And here's the reason why we have these challenges every week. We, as a church, our vision is that we want to immerse every active attender in the Jesus way of life. What does that mean? What does that mean? That means that not only do we want to believe the things that Jesus believed, but we want to act in the way that Jesus acted. We want to do life in the way that Jesus did life. Because we believe that's what God wants for us. So how do we do that? It's not by coming and just talking and getting a good theory about what this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego means. It's saying, okay, how do I actually start living this out now? How do I actually start walking in the ways of Jesus? So here's the challenge. Here's what I want you to do this week. This week, you identify your one thing that God has been telling you to do and take a step towards doing. And it's going to be different for each of us, like I mentioned. For some people, it may be that you look up and you say, you know what, I feel like God has really been telling me I need to engage with my neighbor. They're struggling. I need to be generous toward them, whatever the case may be. If that is what God is telling you your one thing is, then take a step towards doing it. Maybe you don't completely fulfill that mission this week, but you start it. You engage with the neighbor. You ask how you can help. You tell them that you're praying for them. Take a step to do the one thing that God's called you to do. Maybe it's different entirely, and you know there's a situation, or there's a circumstance, or there's a person, or there's something in your life that is hindering your relationship with God, and God is saying that doesn't need to be here. This week, take a step to begin doing what God is calling you to do. Maybe God has been telling you, you know what? I want you to mentor and disciple some other people because you had that done for you, and I'm putting these people in your life. Take a step. One step, whatever God is saying it is. It might be that you say, you know what, I have never really had a connection like this with God. I've never really had a relationship with God. Maybe your one step is that you need to just initiate and begin a relationship with God this week by talking to me, by talking to one of the leaders here, by just checking the box on the back of the green card in the seat in front of you saying, I want more information. Take the step that God has called you to take. Maybe it's you're saying, you know what? I haven't ever been baptized. And yeah, I believe in God, but I need to follow Him in this way. I need to let the world know that I'm dying with Christ and being raised again to new life. Maybe that's the step. Whatever your step is this week, take a step. Start doing what God has asked you to do. This week is our new beginning with God. Let's step into it together. Father, we thank you so much that you pursue us. You are faithful, as we sang earlier. You're the God who not only created the heavens and the earth and knows every one of us by name, but you're the God who wants to be intimately involved in our lives. And I pray that you would give us the strength to begin the thing that you have asked us to do, to step out and do the thing that you have asked us to do this week, Father. Help us not to walk out of here and just accept it as, okay, church is done, another thing to check off the list. But Father, I pray that we would be drawn to you this week. I pray that we would have an intimacy with you that starts with us doing what you call us to do. And as we do that, Father, be gracious and show us yourself. Maybe we don't see you physically the way the King Nebuchadnezzar saw you in that fire, but show us your presence as we step out and begin to follow. We love you so much, Jesus, and we pray these things in the power